Naseem Hamed, aka Prince Naseem, or Nas for short, was one of the most popular British fighters of the 1990s and early 2000s. Now, the first time I saw Prince Naseem was when he fought the rematch with Peter Buckley. If we scroll down here on the box rec, we can find it. It was a fight that they aired on ITV. There it is, the rematch of Peter Buckley. I'm not sure if his previous fights had been televised in full. Maybe they showed highlights of a few of his fights here or there. There might be some footage of the first Buckley fight, but I didn't see it at the time. The first time I saw Prince Naseem was the Buckley rematch. And my first impression of him was, this guy is some kind of Chris Eubank ripoff. Because Chris Eubank was known for his showmanship back in the 1990s. Vaulting over the top rope, prancing around in the ring, all that kind of stuff. But Prince Naseem took it to a next level because he was doing backflips and all this kind of stuff, even in his early fights, which Chris Eubank, senior obviously I'm talking about, wasn't doing. So that was my initial impression of him. He looked like a Chris Eubank ripoff, copycat, etc. Peter Buckley was really a stalwart of the British journeyman scene. He ended up having, I think, well over 100 fights, Peter Buckley, in the end. But Prince Naseem dispatched of Peter Buckley, as you can see, inside 4 rounds. I didn't see the next fight against John Maselli. The next time I saw Prince Naseem was when he fought Vincenzo Belcastro. Now, in this fight, I was more impressed because we got to see more of Prince Naseem. It was for the European Bantamweight title. And it was clear that he had a bit more in terms of razzmatazz in the ring than even Chris Eubank Sr. That's not to say that he was as good as Chris Eubank Sr., but he was more flash than Eubank Sr. in his actual boxing performances. And that's the first time we saw it in a Belcastro fight. I was impressed with his athleticism. So he was down Belcastro a couple times in the fight. The first knockdown I remember was kind of 2 punches, which put Belcastro down. And then the second knockdown, I think, was from 1 punch, or maybe it's the other way around. The first knockdown in the first round and the second in the 11th. Belcastro, a tough guy, but he was absolutely no match for Prince Naseem. And what struck me about Prince Naseem was his incredible confidence, his athleticism, and his punching power. Now, at this point, he was just fighting at European level and not up against a particularly strong European champion. Although Belcastro was fairly useful, but he wasn't somebody that was going to go on from strength to strength and compete at world level. So, an interesting character. That's what I thought Prince Naseem was when I first saw him. Very interesting. He was definitely causing a little bit of a stir at the time. Then he fought this guy here, Picardi. I remember this. Knocked him out in 3 rounds. That was a pretty damn good knockout. Again, not particularly great opposition. The first somewhat notable opponent that Prince Naseem fought was Freddie Cruz. Because Freddie Cruz had fought some world level fighters, lost every time, from what I can remember. But he was known to be tough and durable. I think he was from Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic, somewhere like that. And just to go back on myself a little bit, not only was Prince Naseem seen by some, like myself, as a little bit of a Eubank ripoff, but also a Harold Graham ripoff. Now, obviously, he came from the same stable as Harold Graham. When I found that out, it made a lot more sense why he was fighting the way that he was. And obviously, you know, after watching him a couple times, I realized, okay, this guy's from the same stable as Harold Graham, which is the Winkerbank gym, headed up by, at the time, Brendan Ingle. And the Winkerbank style was really the Harold Graham style. It really all came from Harold Graham. So you could, again, see that with Prince Naseem. But with Prince Naseem, unlike Harold Graham, and unlike Chris Eubank obviously not from the Winkerbank gym, but he did spar and train at the Winkerbank gym for a while at some point in his career, Chris Eubank Sr. But the difference between Prince Naseem that I noticed immediately compared to Eubank or Harold Graham is that he was far more focused on power punches. He would throw punches from crazy angles, leap in with big power shots. He didn't throw that many jabs in a lot of his fights. he would load up on these huge punches from unusual angles, like unusual uppercuts thrown at long range. You know, I mean, one of the few fighters I've ever seen in my whole life who would leap in from long range with uppercuts. I mean, that's something that boxing coaches tell you to never do. Bad enough throwing an uppercut from long range, even worse, leaping in with the uppercut at long range. Prince Naseem was breaking all the rules. But at this stage of his career, that stuff was working for him. So that's one of the reasons that he ended up causing a stir so early. Because not only was he doing backflips and he was very cocky and all this kind of stuff, but he was leaping in with shots and dropping people heavy with these insane looking punches. And another thing with Prince Naseem that impressed me is that he had power in both hands. He had tremendous power in the left hook, the right hand, straight right, straight left hand, uppercut both hands. From any angle and with any punch, he could hurt you. But again, this was at a fairly low level. So he did manage to stop Cruz in 6 rounds, TKO. Cruz never went down, to my recollection, in that fight. He was stopped on his feet. But nonetheless, it was a good performance. He hit Cruz with that signature uppercut. Then for Ramirez, this was a guy with a flat top, like a high top Ramirez. I think it's from the Dominican Republic. And from what I can remember, he dropped this guy with a right hand. And Reg Gutteridge, who was doing the commentary at the time for ITV, said that he folded over like wet laundry. That's how he described Ramirez going down from the Naseem Hamed right hand. Very good shot. And again, these were highlight reel KOs. So on ITV, and for those of you who are not in the UK, maybe you're in other countries, ITV is a free-to-air television station in Britain. So you don't have to pay any kind of subscription or anything like that. It's not a cable station. It's a station that everybody has if you have a television. So this was showcasing Prince Naseem's ability, his showmanship, his braggadociousness, pretty much to the whole country. Then he fought Armando Castro. Castro was a little guy. I remember that. I think he'd moved up in weight. Originally was something like a flyweight. He'd moved up in weight and he looked a lot smaller than Prince Naseem. You know, he was tough though, but Prince Naseem basically just toyed with him. And that's what Naseem was actually doing in his early fights. He was just toying with his opponents. And he kind of tried to do that as he stepped up in competition, but he ended up paying for it by way of getting hit in the mouth a lot more when he stepped up. But yeah, that was his style. He would like to toy with his opponents, goad them. When they were hurt, he would mock them and do that whole rubber leg thing in front of them to kind of copy what they were doing. And a lot of people didn't like it, but whether you liked it or didn't like it, you were talking about it, you know? So yeah, then there was the, as I say, the Castro fight. Castro did go down, but I think from what I can remember, he was stopped on his feet and he protested actually. Castro was stopped on his feet in that fight. And at the time as well, you know, Prince Naseem, promoted by Frank Warren, he was on a lot of the undercards of people like Nigel Benn, Frank Bruno, etc. The top Frank Warren fighters at the time. Prince Naseem was on the undercards and he was actually stealing the show a lot of the time, Prince Naseem. That's another reason why he gained a following very quickly. So where was I? Yeah, fought Castro. Then he fought this guy here, an Argentinian called Sergio Liendo. And this was only a week or two after the Nigel Benn, Gerald McClellan fight. And of course, that ended in tragedy. Gerald McClellan suffered a blood clot on the brain. And to this day, he's in a very, very bad way. Okay, he's pretty much a complete invalid and is taken care of by his sister and others. So this fight was very shortly after the McClellan tragedy. And somehow the referee saw fit to allow Liendo to carry on after Prince Naseem had decked him with a tremendous left hand followed by a right. So he hit Liendo with his left hand. Left hand went down to his haunches, nearly hit the canvas. Then he got up and he was completely gone. Prince Naseem followed up with a right hand and flattened Liendo. Now, Liendo at that point should have been, the fight should have been stopped, should have been waved off. How on earth the referee allowed that to continue? Now look, back in the 90s, referees all over the world would let fights go on a lot more than they tend to today. That happened back then. But even by the 90s standards, that was a shocking decision by the ref to allow Liendo to carry on after that first knockdown. And when Prince Naseem came in for the finish, horrible. He brutally knocked out Sergio Liendo with the follow-up left. Then he fought Enrique Angeles. And this was the first fight that Naseem had on Sky, because up until this point, he was fighting on ITV, up until the Liendo fight. But the Angeles fight was on Sky. Frank Warren took all of his fighters over to Sky. There was a lot of negative publicity about boxing following the Gerald McClellan tragedy, and there were other tragedies at the time as well. And this led to calls within the mainstream of maybe banning boxing. There were lots of medical professionals in the UK talking about banning boxing, and the terrestrial broadcasters like ITV and BBC started to distance themselves from boxing. And that's why Frank Warren started taking his fighters over to Sky. At least that's what he says. And I don't know what the contracts, etc. are like behind the scenes, but he claims that ITV were no longer interested in boxing. So he took his whole stable over to Sky. And I remember being quite annoyed at the time that Frank Warren did that, because on Sky, you had to pay separately for certain channels, like the sports channels, you know. So anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Maybe we'll have that in a different video. But yeah, so he fought Enrique Angeles. See, at the time I didn't have Sky. I used to get videos of my friends who did have Sky of some of these fights. Eventually, I think a year or two later, I got Sky. But yeah, I would get videos of my friends who had Sky and watch these Prince Naseem fights. And of course, when it was big shows, some of them pay-per-view, some of them just regular Sky, I would go to my friends' houses and watch these fights. Yeah, so Enrique Angeles, that was a Mexican guy they brought in, a southpaw, knocked him out in 2 rounds. The second round was one of Prince Naseem's favorite rounds, especially early on in his career. In fact, throughout his career, he tended to like the second round. He didn't have many first round knockouts, Prince Naseem, but the second round, he'd usually figure out which power punches he could land with relative ease. He'd do a scouting report, scouting mission in the first round, and the second round, he'd start letting the bombs fly. And yeah, Angeles caught a right hook, I remember, in that fight, and down he went. He was quite a tall, aggressive Mexican guy, Angeles, but the aggression worked against him. Caught a right hook and down he went. Juan Polo Perez, I think he'd fought at a decent level at some stage in his career, Juan Polo Perez, but, he wasn't a particularly great fighter. Prince Naseem knocked him out in 2. And I remember Perez going down, and he kind of landed in between Prince Naseem's legs somehow. Prince Naseem was so athletic, he'll hit you with a shot, and then he'll be dancing over you before you've fallen back and hit the canvas. Very, very athletically gifted. But yeah, he beat Polo Perez. Now, Prince Naseem was, as you can see, moving up in weight from the start of his career. 114 pounds he turned professional. So that's, what will that be? That'd be in the flyweights, right? Then he moved up to bantamweight, super bantam. By the time he'd fought Perez, he was super bantam. Then he stepped up to featherweight to fight Steve Robertson for the WBO title. Now, up until this point, Prince Naseem was flashy, talented, cocky, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people didn't like Prince Naseem. As much as there was a lot of people who did like him and he was causing a stir in British boxing, there was a lot of people who really didn't like the cockiness. And they were rooting for Steve Robinson to beat him. Now, at the time, Robinson held the WBO featherweight world title. That was a lightly regarded title back then, let's be real. It was the equivalent of holding an IBO title today. And Robinson was kind of how can I describe him? Almost like a Rocky type figure, because early on in his career, he looked like he was just going to be a journeyman, but he somehow strung together some wins at a decent enough level. I don't want to even say to a world level, because the WBO, some of the WBO title fights back in the 90s were questionable, to say the least, just like IBO title fights now. But nonetheless, he was a solid campaigner, Steve Robinson, and a lot of people thought maybe he's just going to be too big for Prince Naseem. who's stepping up another weight division to take on his first world champion of sorts. A lot of it, I think, was wishful thinking. But at the same time, you don't know how good Prince Naseem is at this stage because he's been fighting people who he's supposed to beat. He went in there against Steve Robinson and he smashed Steve Robinson to pieces. The fight really wasn't very competitive. I can't remember giving Steve Robinson a round in the fight, maybe 1 or 2 rounds, if that. But it was really a Prince Naseem masterclass. Robinson was noticeably bigger than Prince Naseem. But from the very opening bell, the confidence of the two fighters was just night and day. Prince Naseem looked the boss from the opening bell. And in fact, he looked the boss. I can't remember which fight it was. Was it after the Perez fight or after the Angeles fight? But Steve Robinson, or maybe it was it after one of Robinson's fights when Prince Naseem got in the ring? I can't remember now, but they had a face-to-face confrontation after one of Robinson or one of Prince Naseem's fights in the ring. And Prince Naseem was all up in Steve Robinson's face, saying, I'll knock you out and I'll do this, that, and the other to you. And Steve Robinson was saying, I'm a proper featherweight and he's more of a super bantamweight. I'm going to be too big for him. But again, the body language, sometimes you can read too much into body language. But in this particular instance, you could tell from the body language that Steve Robinson wasn't as confident as Prince Naseem was. Even though he was trying to talk confident, he didn't look confident to me. And even though Naseem was a lot smaller than Steve Robinson, he was, tiny next to him, he truly believed in himself. And Prince Naseem used to spar much bigger people in the gym in Sheffield. I mean, he was sparring middleweights and even bigger than that. I think he even used to spar Jenny Nelson, although they used to do mainly body sparring in the Winkerbank gym. I think they did do some sparring to the head as well in there. But yeah, he was used to sparring big guys anyway, and he hit way, way, way above his weight, Prince Naseem, which is why he was so confident of going in there and doing a job on Robinson, who, as I say, a tough guy and kind of a rags to riches, rocky, blue-collar type fighter, but nowhere near as talented as the Prince. And as I say, Prince Naseem beat the living crap out of him. Dropped him, I think, twice in the fight. It doesn't actually say here which rounds he dropped him in. But I remember him dropping him in one round with a combination of shots, like 3 or 4 shots that he ripped through Robinson's guard. And then in the 8th round, he hit Robinson with a left hook. And Robinson's legs just gave out. And he ended up on the canvas. And I think he got up and the referee waved it off. I think that's the sequence of events. Or did his corner throw in the towel? I think the ref waved it off. But any of you can go watch that fight. It's on YouTube. It's easily available. So that really right there, at least as far as British boxing went, was the official arrival of Prince Naseem as a legitimate world-level fighter for Britain. That's when most Brits got on board and realized, okay, Prince Naseem can really fight. In his first defense of that WBO belt, he fought Saeed Lawal, who was a Nigerian fighter. Pretty obscure, to be honest with you, and one of the fastest knockouts you'll ever see. Before the main camera had even zoomed in at the start of round 1, Lawal was on the floor. Literally ding, ding. Prince Naseem comes out. The first punch of the fight, Lawal's down. And he didn't last much longer after that. So yeah, that was a little bit of a farce of a fight there for Prince Naseem. His next fight was a little bit more of a test, and that was against the unbeaten Puerto Rican Daniel Alicia, who actually dropped Naseem in the first round. And Naseem kind of got the bit between his teeth and knocked Alicia out in the second. That was a brutal, brutal knockout in the second. Dropped him twice. The first shot, from what I can remember, was I think it was a right hook. Was it a right hook or a left hook? And Alicia kind of wobbled for a second. Prince Naseem followed up. I'm not sure if the follow-up even hit him, but Daniel Alicia went down. Then the final combination was like a right, left, right, I think, from Prince Naseem. And Daniel Alicia went down hard, and the referee waved it off without a count. So yeah, that was an exciting performance, but the first sign of serious vulnerability because he was dropped in the fight in the first. He wasn't like seriously hurt or anything when he went down against Daniel Alicia, because Prince Naseem used to like to do so many unusual things with his feet and mess around with his balance that he could often be caught off balance in between moving and switching stances and all this kind of stuff. He could be caught and knocked off balance. It happened to him a couple times in his career, truth be told. Prince Naseem never had a particularly bad chin or anything like that, because you get some of this from particularly American fight fans who say, oh, Prince Naseem had no chin. Prince Naseem never got knocked out. There was never a time when Prince Naseem got hit and dropped from a shot and he ever looked seriously out of it. Never. So, yeah, he went down a few times in his career, but he never looked seriously out of it at any stage. And he actually had a pretty decent chin. But as I say, because he was so reckless, his hands down, his chin in the air, swaying back from punches and leaving himself off balance at times, lunging in with punches, this resulted in him being dropped a couple times. But anyway, after the Daniel Alicia fight, he then fought Manuel Medina. Now, this was the first proper, tried and tested world-level fighter that Prince Naseem had fought, was Manuel Medina. I mean, years after this, this was in 96, many, many years later, I think it might have been in the early 2000s, Manuel Medina beat Scott Harrison. Just to put it in perspective, Manuel Medina had fought Tom Johnson several times, Alejandro Gonzalez, and he was a very, very tough man. Obviously had several losses at the time, but he went on even to have good wins after the Prince Naseem fight. And he gave Prince Naseem a real tough time. Eventually stopped in the 11th round, but Prince Naseem was getting hit with a lot of punches in the fight. Manuel Medina, a really tall guy, much taller than Prince Naseem, was able to hit him with shots at long range, was able to absorb most of Prince Naseem's power punches, at least up until the 11th, before he eventually succumbed. Prince Naseem claimed that it was down to him having the flu or cold in terms of why he got hit so much, because he used to brag about how elusive he was and how great his defense was. And at that stage, people started asking questions. Is Prince Naseem really as elusive as he claims? Or is it just a case of him getting found out for having a leaky defense as he steps up the level of opposition? And really and truly, the latter seemed to be the case. Because dropped by Daniel Alicia, then he has a real tough fight with Manuel Medina, who was a quality operator, truth be told. Particularly the victory over Alejandro Gonzalez. If I can just show you here. Manuel Medina had many fights in his career. Where's the Alejandro Gonzalez fight? Also fought John Molina, the Tom Johnson fights, obviously. There you go. That was probably certainly one of his best wins of his career was when he beat Alejandro Gonzalez. It was a good win for Manuel Medina. But, fought many other fighters as well. Victor Polo. Okay. Paul Ingle, of course. Johnny Tapia. Very famous name in boxing. The Scott Harrison fights. Kevin Kelley, etc., etc., etc. So he was a quality operator. He wasn't one of the very elite guys, Manuel Medina, but he was, definitely quality and a tough night's work for anybody. After he beat Manuel Medina, he then fought this guy who I think was another Argentinian, Regimio Molina, knocked him out in 2 rounds. That's one of his favorite rounds, as I said before. Then he fought Tom Johnson. Now, Tom Johnson was a long reigning champion. This was something like his 10th or 11th defense when he fought Prince Naseem. And, Johnson had been in some tough fights and whatever, but still, this was a long reigning world champion. And to me, this might be the best performance of Prince Naseem's career. Certainly top 3, top 4 performances. Now, he did get caught a couple times in the Tom Johnson fight, but for the most part, similar to against Steve Robinson, he was in control from pretty early on. The body language, the punching power, the ring generalship, truth be told, was all in Prince Naseem's favor. Now, Tom Johnson had bits of success here and there because he was a technically good fighter, Tom Johnson. American, been champion for a long time, good technically, but he did show vulnerability in some of his previous fights in terms of punch resistance. He'd been on the floor and whatnot. And going in there against a guy like Naseem Hamed, if you've got any kind of issues with punch resistance, he's almost certainly going to find them out. And he found them out against Tom Johnson. Not to say that anybody else who hadn't been hit, anybody else who got hit with the kind of shots that Johnson got hit with wouldn't have been hurt as well, because they probably would have, truth be told. The punch which finished the fight was a tremendous uppercut in the 8th round. I remember Johnson kind of came forward groggily because he was hurt, and Prince Naseem walked him onto this right uppercut, and Johnson went down on his front, and he had like spit on the side of his face that had flown out, and there was just no way that he was ever going to recover from that punch. So tremendous knockout win. And that's the first fight really which made the Americans, I think the fight was broadcast on Showtime, and that made some of the Americans sit up and take notice of Prince Naseem. He never actually got enough credit for that win, truth be told, from the Americans. You know, back then, as is the case today, the American media, and therefore most of the American public, would never give British fighters as much credit as they deserved. British fighters used to have to do, and still do, they used to have to achieve twice as much as an American fighter just to get half the amount of credit. It was like that back then, it's still like that today. Whereas with the British media, they readily give American fighters the credit they deserve. The British media, and actually to some degree, the British public, are far more fair when it comes to giving foreign fighters and rivals of their fighters the credit they're due. They're far more fair. The American press, notoriously biased, particularly when it comes to British fighters. But be that as it may, the Tom Johnson fight did make some of the American press sit up and take note of Prince Naseem. Now, many of them were still unsold on him, even though he took out a long-reigning American champion. But one thing they kind of were sold on was the punching power, because that was obvious. This guy can really hit. And for me, Prince Naseem, still to this day, is one of the hardest punching featherweights in history. I've never seen a featherweight who can hit like Prince Naseem since then. I'm talking about featherweight, not super feather. Obviously, Floyd Mayweather was super featherweight when he turned pro, and he was a very hard puncher at that weight. We'll come on to that a little bit later on. But Prince Naseem at featherweight was a small guy. You know, he'd moved up from, I think, was it Superfly and Bantam, Super Bantam throughout his career. Did he start his career at Bantam or Superfly? I can't remember now. But either way, he moved up through the weights. Featherweight was really the limit for Prince Naseem. He wasn't as big. He's only a short guy. He wasn't as big as people like Barrera, Morales, Floyd Mayweather. They were all much bigger than him, even though they were floating around similar kind of weight classes early on in their careers. Featherweight was really the limit for Naz. So beats Tom Johnson. Then he fights Billy Hardy, who was European, I think, European featherweight champion at the time. Knocked him out in one round. Really wasn't much of a fight. And as with many Prince Naseem opponents, they said that his punching power was unreal. You know, Billy Hardy seemed to be very confident going into the Prince Naseem fight. But after the fight, he said his punching power is crazy. Then he fought Juan Cabrera, again, not a very good opponent. Was this another Argentine? I feel like Prince Naseem fought loads of Argentinians. Yeah, another Argentine. Fought loads of Argentinians in his career and usually beat the living daylights out of them. An obscure Argentine who he battered in two. Jose Badillo. Now that was a real good performance from Prince Naseem. He was elusive in that fight. He used a lot more jabs and boxing rather than just looking for big power shots against Jose Badillo. Jose Badillo was a real tough guy. You know, not an elite top level fighter, but he was definitely tough. And actually, I forgot to mention, Prince Naseem relinquished his IBF title somewhere around, was it after the Cabrera? It must have been after the Cabrera fight. I can't remember the reason for him relinquishing the IBF title because, as I say, at the time, the only source of information for boxing fans was boxing publications, the magazines. And I can't remember what was said in the magazines at the time as an explanation as to why Prince Naseem relinquished his IBF belt. Did he get stripped or did he relinquish? I can't remember off the top of my head. But he fought Jose Badillo, again, not a particularly great fighter, but you know, a tough guy, dispatched him in 7. A lot of people at the time, like on Sky, they were saying that was like Muhammad Ali versus Cleveland Williams. Obviously, they were going overboard saying that because Cleveland Williams was, you know, he'd maybe seen better days when he fought Muhammad Ali, but he was more accomplished than Jose Badillo and a lot more proven. So, yeah, but nonetheless, it was a good performance. Prince Naseem was elusive and stopped the guy. I don't think he floored Jose Badillo in the fight. He was stopped on his feet. He was tough. Then came his American debut against Kevin Kelley. Now, Kevin Kelley only had one loss at the time against Alejandro Gonzalez. And in fact, he quit in the Gonzalez fight. That's how he lost his unbeaten record. And both of his eyes were swollen. That's one thing about Kevin Kelley is his eyes would swell up very badly in fights. He had the swollen eyes against Alejandro Gonzalez in his first loss. And he had a massive swollen eye, I think in the Derek Gainer fight. Well, he had a couple fights with Derek Gainer. The one where he knocked Derek Gainer out with one punch. And Derek Gainer was a good friend of Roy Jones. But I'm going all over the place here, people. Bear with me. But in the Derek Gainer fight, I seem to remember he had a massive swollen eye as well. So Kevin Kelley had eyes that would swell up very easily. And they swelled up in the Alejandro Gonzalez fight, who was a real tough, top-level Mexican world champion and all that. And Kevin Kelley quit in the corner. I think it was like the 10th or 11th round. And it was either the ref or one of the cornermen asked Kevin Kelley, "Do you want to continue?" And he said, "It's up to you guys." Like that's not the kind of answer you give if you actually want to continue. You don't say it's up to you guys, but he said it's up to you guys, but I can't see. So yeah, Kevin Kelley quit in that fight. But look, he came back even after the loss to Prince Naseem, and he proved he had plenty of heart in subsequent fights, and before and since. So anyway, the Kevin Kelley fight in New York, Prince Naseem came to the ring. One of his spectacular ring entrances. I think that's the one where he came on a magic carpet, wasn't it? Or was that a different one? No. He came in some kind of like swing or something for the Kevin Kelley fight. It was a different fight, I think, in Britain where he came down on a magic carpet. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm confusing a couple different entrances. But he had loads of these spectacular ring entrances. And you really don't see ring entrances like that anymore. You see kind of pyrotechnics and all that kind of business that they use for some ring entrances, but you never see people coming down on magic carpets and all this kind of stuff like Prince Naseem would do. But he brought that to New York, and Naseem was a very confident character, but you could tell in the run-up to that Kevin Kelley fight that he was a little more nervous, and he was feeling the pressure a little bit more than usual. You could tell from his demeanor and all that kind of stuff, the look in his eyes, the first time fighting in the United States. When a Brit goes over to the United States, I don't know what it's like now, but back then they used to pull all kinds of shenanigans behind the scenes to try and unsettle the fighter. That was very, very common. And to be fair, maybe they did it internally. Maybe certain American fighters did it to other fighters. They would pull all kinds of backstage shenanigans to try and unsettle the opponent. And as I say, that was well documented by many British fighters who said that this would happen. Kind of similar to what the Klitschko's used to do behind the scenes over there in Germany when they were reigning at the top. They'd play all kind of shenanigans to upset all the opponents. So that's one thing that, British fighters always used to have to contend with, particularly if it was a British fighter who was really hyped, who was seen as somebody that was coming over to try and conquer America. The American patriotism would kick in, and a lot of people behind the scenes would kind of conspire to do everything they could to unsettle the British fighter. But nonetheless, Prince Naseem went in there against Kevin Kelley, got dropped in the first round, and it turned into a firefight where really boxing skills went out of the window, and it was all about heart, bravado, machismo, all that kind of stuff. And Prince Naseem, as technically vulnerable as he was, because Kevin Kelley, a tall guy, fast hands, only lost once in his career and was obviously a former world champion. Even though, Kelley had the height and reach and speed and all that kind of stuff, his chin was always vulnerable, Kevin Kelley. I remember when he fought on the undercard of Lennox Lewis versus Phil Jackson against a guy called Jesse Benavidez, and Benavidez dropped him in that fight. And I remember Kevin Kelley in the post-fight interview said, it wasn't really a knockdown, like my feet got crossed up or something. He just made up some absolute nonsense explanation for getting dropped. No, he just got hit with a hard shot and dropped. So yeah, Kevin Kelley's chin was always a little suspect, and that eventually again told. A tough guy, don't get it twisted, but that eventually told in the Prince Naseem fight after both guys had hit the deck Prince Naseem's superior punching power and his better chin won that fight for him. And Prince Naseem was down, but his gloves hit the canvas. You know, Prince Naseem's backside never touched the canvas. His gloves hit the canvas. And again, that was more to do with balance than anything else. No, sorry, excuse me. No, Prince Naseem was down. His backside did hit the canvas in the first round. Excuse me. Because he backed Kevin Kelley into a corner, and then Kevin Kelley came out swinging. And as Prince Naseem was leaning back, Kevin Kelley caught him with a shot and Prince Naseem went down. Again, it was more of a balance thing, but it was a legitimate knockdown. It's in one of the subsequent rounds where Prince Naseem's gloves touched the canvas. That's the one I was thinking of. But yeah, he did hit the canvas in the first. Wild fight, but ultimately, as I say, Prince Naseem's power and Kevin Kelley's chin resulted in a fourth round knockout win for Prince Naseem. Because when Kevin Kelley went down in that fight, he was going down hard. You know, he was going down hard from the punches, whereas Prince Naseem wasn't really. But that, at that point, was seen by most people as Prince Naseem's best win, or one of Prince Naseem's best wins anyway. So prior to that, Manuel Medina was one of his best wins, Tom Johnson, and then Kevin Kelley. Then he fought Wilfredo Vasquez. Now, Vasquez had been a long reigning champion at super bantamweight, the weight below, and tough guy from Puerto Rico. He'd been champion at featherweight, I think, for a relatively short amount of time, Wilfredo Vasquez. And was he stripped or something of his title before he fought Prince Naseem? Because he did have, I think, the WBA belt, but it says it wasn't on the line here. But I'm sure Vasquez held the WBA belt at featherweight. Maybe my memory is betraying me here. Let's have a look. Yeah, there we go. WBA belt, featherweight title. I can't remember. There was some kind of politics that meant that the belt wasn't on the line in the Prince Naseem fight, because that was supposed to be a unification, that particular fight. Anyway, fought Wilfredo Vasquez, dispatched him in 7 rounds. A very, very good performance by Prince Naseem. Wilfredo Vasquez, again, good fighter, had a lot of fights, been around a long time, long reigning champion at a lower weight, stepped up, was champion at featherweight, and Naseem dealt with him. From what I can remember, Vasquez was also stopped on his feet. Prince Naseem hit with a combination, his legs gave way, the referee stepped in and saved Vasquez from the inevitable, devastating KO. So, yeah, that was a good performance by Prince Naseem. And you could see that Naseem was far more comfortable fighting at home than he was fighting in New York away. Yeah, there isn't the kind of shenanigans behind the scenes to try and unsettle you and all that type of business. And it's just the familiarity of the environment that you know. So whenever he brought Americans, Puerto Ricans, etc., Mexicans over to the UK, he usually would put in a more confident display than when he had to go over to the States. Other than maybe in the Medina fight, he fought confidently against Medina, but it was tough, because Medina didn't care about any reputation because he was a real tried and tested world level fighter. And had a very good chin, by the way, Manuel Medina. Then he fought Wayne McCulloch. Now, Wayne McCulloch, an Irish fighter, but based out in the United States, they used to call him the Pocket Rocket. McCulloch was known for throwing loads of punches. That's why they called him the Pocket Rocket. He used to throw hundreds of punches, but he also had a very, very good chin. Wasn't a particularly great puncher, Wayne McCulloch, but he had a very, very good chin. I'm not sure if McCulloch was ever down in his career. Was he down in the Prince Naseem fight? I swear he wasn't down in the Prince Naseem fight. He had a real, real good chin, Wayne McCulloch, but he did lose soundly on points, as you can see on all the judges' scorecards. And McCulloch really was the small guy in that fight. You know, he was better at the lighter weights, from what I can remember. Let's have a look. Truth be told, I never followed Wayne McCulloch's career as anywhere near as closely as Prince Naseem's career. Daniel Zaragoza, he was a great fighter, actually. And I swear the Zaragoza family now make boxing gloves. I think it's like a Zaragoza boxing glove company. Mexican. Johnny Breeder, of course, from Denmark. He fought there. But yeah, I do remember Wayne McCulloch, but I definitely didn't follow his career as much as Prince Naseem's career. But I do obviously remember the Prince Naseem fight. Paul Ingle was unbeaten at the time, good fighter. Prince Naseem took him out late. But you see, this period here of Prince Naseem's career, between the Wayne McCulloch fight and the Cesar Soto fight, people started questioning Prince Naseem's hunger, and also his punching power, because all of a sudden he was going late in fights. Before he'd been blasting people away. Wilfredo Vasquez didn't go 7, Kevin Kelley 4, Jose Badillo, Cabrera, Billy Hardy, Tom Johnson. Most of these people have been getting blasted away in spectacular fashion. But then he fought McCulloch and went the distance. Paul Ingle went 11 rounds. Cesar Soto went the distance. And people were looking at Prince Naseem and thinking he's lost his step. And I remember Prince Naseem doing interviews going into the Vianney Bungu fight, saying that he was kind of losing love for the sport of boxing because he'd been boxing since he was 8 years old. And there's a saying in boxing, and the saying goes, the sooner you start, the sooner you finish, which basically means the earlier you start boxing, the earlier you're probably going to retire, because it's not necessarily about your age, but how much wear and tear there is on your body. Age plays a factor, don't get it twisted. It does play a part. But by this stage, Prince Naseem was only in his, mid or late 20s? I think he retired at the age of 27 or 28, Prince Naseem. So at this stage, he was still a young man, but he'd been boxing a very, very long time. And he was also enjoying the spoils of his success. He was a millionaire, big celebrity in the UK, always making front page headlines and all that kind of stuff. So going into the Bungu fight, Bungu had been a very good world champion, again at a lower weight. So even though he was a very good fighter, this was a smaller guy moving up. And in fact, I think he moved up specifically to challenge Prince Naseem. I think he was still a world champion at a lighter weight. Correct me if I'm wrong. But he was a very, very good fighter. In fact, you can see here from South Africa. Let me just double check, but I'm sure he was world champion when he stepped up to fight Prince Naseem. Obviously beat Danny Romero. Kid Dynamite was a real good puncher, Danny Romero. And was world champion here. Okay, yeah. So he stepped up literally to fight Prince Naseem. But as you can see, a very, very long reigning world champion, held the IBF World Bantamweight title for a long time, beat Kennedy McKinney, who was a real good fighter. And I'll come on to Kennedy McKinney a little bit later on. But yeah, Prince Naseem went in there against Bungu, knocked him out in 4, and that was seen as a return to form for Prince Naseem at the time, because people have been, questioning whether he still had it anymore. But he went in there and took care of Bungu in 4 rounds, a long reigning champion at a lower weight, and people felt like, okay, Prince Naseem's back now. Then he returned to the United States, the first time since he'd fought Wayne McCulloch in the States. And he went up against Augie Sanchez. Now, Augie Sanchez only had 1 loss at the time on his record, but truth be told, wasn't a great fighter. His claim to fame, even now, is that he beat Floyd Mayweather in the amateurs, Augie Sanchez. But nonetheless, he had plenty of ambition, I guess, still when he fought Prince Naseem. He only had 1 loss on the record and he was looking to do stuff in boxing. But yeah, he made it difficult for Prince Naseem. I think Naseem was dropped but didn't get a count in the fight and got touched up in there. Augie Sanchez, left him with some facial damage and whatever. But ultimately, Naseem got hold of him and ripped some tremendous punches, as is usually the case with Prince Naseem. Put some tremendous shots together. Down went Augie Sanchez, and the referee stopped it again, I think, without a count. But that fight there was supposed to be a fairly run-of-the-mill defense for Prince Naseem. It was supposed to be more of a showcase fight for him in the States, but it turned out to be a real tough fight. It's kind of similar to the Kevin Kelley fight, where Prince Naseem had to take his licks. Then, of course, he fought Marco Antonio Barrera. And this is the one fight which Americans always talk about when it comes to Prince Naseem. They completely disregard anything he'd ever done in his career before, and all they ever focus on is the Barrera fight. Now, Marco Antonio Barrera himself had lost several times before he fought Prince Naseem. His first look, because remember, he'd also moved up in weight, just like Prince Naseem. He was a super bantamweight earlier on in his career, then he moved up to featherweight. And I remember an early Marco Antonio Barrera, they used to call him the baby-faced assassin, and he was an out-and-out pressure fighter early on in Barrera's career. By the time he fought Prince Naseem, as I say, he'd lost to Junior Jones a couple times, Poison Junior Jones. In fact, I want to show you this now, because this is where Kennedy McKinney comes into it. So Barrera, who has kind of an unusual background for a fighter, particularly a Mexican fighter, in that he wasn't from a poor family. Barrera was actually from a pretty well-to-do middle-class family in Mexico, and he was training to be a lawyer. In fact, I think he might have some kind of degree in law or whatever. But rather than go down that road, he wanted to become a boxer, Marco Antonio Barrera. And he was doing very, very well. They were putting him on the cover of various different boxing publications at the time, the Babyfaced Assassin, and he held the WBO title at super bantamweight. And of course, Kennedy McKinney is one of the people that he beat, and this is where the rock, paper, scissors comes into boxing again. So he beat Kennedy McKinney, but then lost by knockout to, well, DQ officially, but really it was a knockout, to Poison Junior Jones. Now, Junior Jones, he kind of reminded me a little bit of like a very miniature version of Tommy Hearns. Wasn't as good as Tommy Hearns, but similar kind of style, long range, tall, lanky guy who could really punch with the right hand. And as I mentioned in a recent video, most fighters who lose by knockout, when they have an immediate rematch, they lose again. Now, in this particular instance, Barrera didn't lose the rematch earlier than he lost the first fight, but he still lost. You know, kind of like Shane Mosley, when he lost the first fight to Vernon Forrest, he then had the rematch and lost that as well. The result goes the same way. And there you go, an immediate rematch. Even somebody as great as Marco Antonio Barrera, he couldn't win the immediate rematch. So we really need to give credit to fighters out there at the top level who do win these immediate rematches, because it's not an easy thing to do. You're not just battling your opponent, you're also battling the demons in your own head. Yeah, the opponent is only half the battle. The demons in your head are the other half of the battle. But Barrera couldn't overcome them demons in such a short space of time, and Junior Jones was able to beat him again. Obviously, styles make fights as well, but there's also a mental element of it that you have to take into account. Junior Jones, of course, who did he lose to, people? Yes, he lost. He'd already lost by that point, and that was a big upset at the time, by the way, when he beat Marco Antonio Barrera. But Junior Jones lost to Kennedy McKinney. Right after he beat Barrera, he lost to McKinney, who Barrera had beaten. Yeah? So there, again, it shows you many of the things I talk about in boxing with regards to how difficult it is to win an immediate rematch, even for a great fighter like Barrera. And also the whole rock, paper, scissors scenario, where just because fighter A beats fighter B and fighter B beats fighter C, it doesn't mean that fighter C can't beat fighter A. And you see it right there with Marco Antonio Barrera, Poison Junior Jones, and Kennedy McKinney. It's kind of a round robin type situation. So getting back to Prince Naseem, going into the Barrera fight, he was very arrogant. He felt like Barrera was tailor-made for him. And I think the pre-Junior Jones version of Barrera was tailor-made for Prince Naseem, because the pre-Junior Jones version was really just a typical Mexican pressure fighter who come forward, wasn't afraid to take shots, you know, always had a great left hook to the body, liked to apply a lot of pressure. That style is exactly the style that Prince Naseem loved to fight against. And that's why I felt at the time that Prince Naseem was going to knock this guy out, because I'd seen Junior Jones knock out Barrera. You know, I'd seen Barrera for many years fighting, and I'd seen Prince Naseem fight that style. Nobody as good as Barrera before with that particular style, but nonetheless, you're going to walk straight into Prince Naseem's power. You're going to give him all the opportunities he needs to get them big uppercuts off and all that kind of stuff. And I think Prince Naseem was thinking the same. But Marco Antonio Barrera flipped the script. He didn't come in with a pressure fighting style. He used his height and reach because he was taller than Prince Naseem, had longer arms than Prince Naseem, flipped the script and decided to box at long range and not give Prince Naseem anything to counter. So Prince Naseem's a shorter guy. He's being kept to the end of a jab, you know, and Marco Antonio Barrera was controlling the distance and the the real estate, as Teddy Atlas likes to call it, of the ring very, very well. And in Prince Naseem's corner, at this stage, I should briefly talk about Naseem's relationship with his trainer, Brendan Ingle. They fell out over money, as is the case many times in boxing, kind of similar to Gennady Golovkin and Abel Sanchez. You know how they fell out over money? From what I've heard, the Prince Naseem Brendan Ingle situation was similar, and Brendan Ingle had trained Prince Naseem since he was an amateur, since he was a little kid, and taking him all the way through to, you know, multiple world titles and whatnot. They eventually fell out, and Naseem replaced Brendan Ingle with Manny Stewart, and he also had another trainer whose name I forget. Was he a Mexican trainer or Cuban? I can't remember the guy's name now. God, I can't think of it. I'm sure one of you guys will remind me in the comments what his name was. Prince Naseem's Latino trainer. But for the Barrera fight, he had Manny Stewart and the other trainer in the corner taking turns as head coach for alternate rounds. I mean, the whole thing was a joke. So for one round, Manny Stewart comes in and gives Prince Naseem instructions. And for a different round, the other trainer comes in and it's like, come on, man. That's nonsense. And that's what Prince Naseem was doing. So you could see that his team was in disarray. Even Manny Stewart talked about how behind the scenes in the lead up to the Barrera fight, Naz didn't have the mindset needed to produce his best performance against that particular opponent. He was far too lackadaisical, wasn't taking Barrera as seriously as he should have taken him, and he ended up losing on points as a result. Going back to the attitude that a lot of American, let's say, a lot of the American press, as well as the American public, have towards British fighters in general, but in this case, Prince Naseem, I've seen American fans online say that, yeah, Prince Naseem thought he was tough and whatever until he fought Barrera, then he got his ass knocked out. It's like, Prince Naseem never even went down in the Barrera. People talking about the fight have never even seen it. How about he got knocked out? He never even went down. He never came close to going down in the fight. There was no knockdowns in the fight. It went a distance. He got outboxed by Marco Antonio Barrera. Certainly never came close to getting knocked out. And again, being outboxed by Marco Antonio Barrera, how does that make you a terrible fighter? If he was a terrible fighter, Prince Naseem, an absolute hype job and he was no good, then why didn't Barrera knock him out? If Prince Naseem is that bad, Barrera should have knocked him out. But he didn't knock him out. He won on points. And as I say, Barrera obviously moved up through the weights and, became a great fighter. His legendary rivalry with Eric Morales and all that kind of stuff. But Prince Naseem finished his career with a record of 36-1, the one loss being to an all-time great in Marco Antonio Barrera on points. That is not a bad record, and that is not a bad fighter. Was he an all-time great? I mean, he was a very, very good featherweight champion. There have been many great featherweights over the decades. One thing I will say, you can debate how great he was because he did win world titles multiple times at the weight class, and he really wasn't as big as guys like Barrera to be able to go up any higher than featherweight. But one thing I'll say about him is that he was a very good world champion, and he was one of the hardest punchers I've ever seen in any weight class, pound for pound. He had tremendous punching power. Now, obviously, Barrera fought the way that he did, which is very conservatively against Prince Naseem. He kept a very tight guard. He kept it at long range because he knew that Naseem could seriously hit. He took Naseem's counter-punching mechanism away from him because Naseem would rely on you coming at him to be able to counter you. And he neutralized his power. Yeah. After the fight, he said, he doesn't have any power and all this kind of stuff. But truth be told, he never really got hit by a serious Prince Naseem shot. Kind of similar to Badou Jack when he fought Adonis Stevenson. He kind of downplayed Stevenson's power after the fight. But truth be told, Stevenson never really managed to catch him the way that he caught other fighters, the way he caught Chad Dawson. He never caught Badou Jack like that. And same way with Barrera. Prince Naseem never really caught him properly. And that's obviously credit to Barrera's boxing skills because he totally outboxed Prince Naseem in the fight. proved he was the far superior boxer. And as I say, that seems to live in the memory more than anything else in the minds of American boxing fans, which of course is unfair because they seem to dismiss anything that happens outside of the US. This very myopic mentality. And look, I'm not talking about all American boxing fans. There are plenty of American boxing fans out there who give credit where it's due, but there's also a lot who don't. And look, Naseem Hamed is not going to go down as the greatest featherweight of all time or anything like it, but he's far better than most American boxing fans will have you believe he is. Again, if he wasn't, he'd have a lot more than one loss and Barrera would have knocked him out. It wouldn't have gone 12. Yeah. And again, if you look through his career, he had some good wins. Ending the run of Tom Johnson. It was like his 10th or 11th title defense. Beating people like Kevin Kelley, Wilfredo Vasquez, Wayne McCulloch was a good fighter. Vianney Bungu was a good win. So, these are solid wins against good fighters at the time. He doesn't have any wins over all-time greats, that has to be said. And perhaps that's why he won't go down as an all-time great, Prince Naseem. Maybe an all-time great British fighter, but in terms of globally, is he an all-time great? I mean, is Mike Tyson an all-time great? Mike Tyson never beat any all-time greats other than Larry Holmes. And Larry Holmes was well past it by the time he fought Mike Tyson. Is Mike Tyson an all-time great? I'd say Mike Tyson was. Now, Prince Naseem wasn't dominating divisions the way Mike Tyson was during the mid to late 80s in the heavyweight division. But Mike Tyson's opposition, was it any better than Prince Naseem's opposition? I don't know. So that's something that people can debate. But Prince Naseem was a lot more than a hype job. He was a very, very good fighter. He was a destructive puncher. And people need to pay attention to the Tom Johnson win and, wins like that. Just because they didn't happen in the United States, it doesn't mean they're not good wins. Because this seems to be the attitude of some American fans. It has to happen in America or it doesn't count. Tom Johnson fight, American guy, long reigning champion, happened in the UK. Naseem ripped him to shreds. Anyway, that's my video on Prince Naseem, his career, my career review. That's what I call these videos. So let me know what you guys think. I'm sure there are some of you out there who also have fond memories of the Naseem Hamed era. He was a great showman, a very talented fighter with a big punch and great athleticism, but ultimately never quite succeeded at elite level. And there were fights which were talked about back in the days, like he was going to fight Marquez at one point. According to HBO, Marquez turned down the fight. And you can see HBO say this. I think it's on the Augie Sanchez card where, I think it's Jim Lampley, is it? Or somebody. It's either, I think it's HBO anyway. Or was it Showtime people saying it? Pretty sure it's HBO. Can't remember who screened that fight now. Such a long time ago. But I do remember one of the American commentators putting up a graphic and they said that their network had offered Marquez the fight against Prince Naseem and he turned it down. So that fight never happened. The Mayweather fight, Prince Naseem never wanted that. And let's be real, Mayweather would have toyed with Prince Naseem. Far too big, far too powerful, far too talented. That wouldn't have been a competitive fight. There was also a guy called, God, his name escapes me, Acelino Freitas, from Brazil. These were people a weight division above. So Floyd Mayweather was super featherweight. Acelino Freitas was super featherweight. And they were calling Prince Naseem out. Naseem was really too small to move up to super featherweight. And certainly would have lost the Mayweather fight. The Acelino Freitas fight would have probably been more competitive because although Freitas was a tremendous puncher himself, he was chinny. I mean, Acelino Freitas was dropped by Barry Jones of all people. No disrespect to Barry Jones, but he wasn't exactly heavy-handed. So, yeah, those were fights that Prince Naseem never fancied, moving up a weight class and taking on Mayweather or Freitas. But as I say, Marquez apparently turned the fight down, and he did fight Barrera eventually. Because that fight was in the works for a long time, by the way. a lot of people may not realize this, he'd been linked to Barrera when Barrera was still unbeaten. But then Barrera, went and lost to Junior Jones, and that kind of threw everything off. So, the fight didn't happen at that stage. But eventually they got it together, and Barrera came out on top. Anyway, let me stop waffling about Prince Naseem, his life and times in the world of boxing. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's Hatman, I'm out.
Hatman merch is now available. We got t-shirts, vests, hoodies, and more. Just click the link below. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.